I'm going to brag on my wife for a second too. I don't know how many hours she spent to learn how to take video from her iPhone and convert it so that you all could see it. But I would estimate it was 100 hours.
Oh, no.
I mean,
Not that long.
It took over a week, I believe. However, you know, if we'd had a teenager, it would have taken, what, 10 minutes? And she did learn, and she said next month will be a snap, because now she knows how to do it. So, thank you, honey.
And we have a and we have a podium.
And we have a podium. Yes, we do. Don, speaking of Abraham Lincoln.
Oh!
Don, do you want to show them what you brought today? Where is Don?
I'm right here.
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Well, I was over at Werther's a year or so ago, and I saw that over stuck in the corner, they had a newspaper for sale that nobody seemed to be interested in, so I went ahead and bought it. It is the New York Herald of the day Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
Oh my gosh.
So I took it in and I had it museum with museum glass and frame, and when they did that, they said, well, did you know that you had the entire newspaper? And they made copies of every page, which I've given to our instructor so he can take it home and take a look at it.
Read it. See what happens.
To read it. What I felt was most interesting is the difference in styles between the way they did newspapers then and the way they do newspapers now. There wasn't a reporter that gave a narration of what happened. What they did is took statements from all the people, different people that were at the theater at the time, telling what they saw. So I found that very interesting. Anyway, I brought it so if you want to take a look at it, it's there.
Very impressive. And this is, by the way, something. This is someone, Don, who knows how to preserve historical artifacts. Not only nicely framed, but he put on no glare glass, protective glass, and as a result, it's just in wonderful conditions. From April 15, 1865.
I got a real buy on it. The newspaper cost a lot less than the framing. It was only like $100 for the newspaper, and I asked the auctioneer, I said, why no interest? I was the only bidder. He said, well, this is South Carolina. They didn't care about what happened.
Oh, man.
We are Carol. That's the only Southerner here. I'll take it.
Right. What a great story. I also, before we get rolling, I want to thank Paul Weiss and Nan Jones for last month. They did an excellent job. Thank you both. Again, on the YouTube video, it's kind of half and half, the two of them, and I just thought they were very good. So we certainly want to encourage members who have stories and research and their own personal passions for different moments in history to certainly bring them to our attention, and we can keep doing that. Finally, before we get rolling, I wanted to touch on two things. Oh, by the way, I also want to welcome, we have some new members. We're now over 60.
70.
Over 70.
We're at 75 right now.
75. We've come back a long way from the virus.
Sure have.
That's great. That's great. And, well, thank you. And thank all of you. And we have some new members here today. And so you're all very welcome. Last time, I only talked a little bit for the relief of everybody. I only talked a little bit at the end. But I mentioned two people. I just wanted to kind of close out, since we didn't have slides, close out that story.
You thought everything was going to work.
It helps if you turn it on. I had talked about Ernie Pyle last time. You may remember near the end, the very famous war correspondent in World War II, and we had been talking about Okinawa a little bit, and Ernie Pyle was here he is with servicemen. Ernie Pyle was in both the European theater and also in the Pacific theater, and he was on Okinawa when he was killed by a Japanese sniper. So I just wanted to show you what we were talking about at the end, so you can see. For one thing, you can see what an enormous, how famous he was. He was the GI's favorite journalist, and was widely published, and tried to present the war from the standpoint of not the generals or the admirals, but the average GI, if you will. So Ernie Pyle, I wanted to give him proper recognition today. I also like this headline: the reporter who hated war but loved the troops. And I'll give my standard World War II caveat. Yes, you're going to hear in headlines Japs, which we don't say today, and you're going to hear Nips, which we don't say today. Unavoidable. You can't show a document from the war era and not do that. This is, by the way, this is where he was killed. A couple GIs erected a sign, "Lost a buddy," April 1945. And this cartoon appeared EP 30. If you've ever been a journalist, you know 30 means the end of a story. And that cartoon was shown in papers around the world.
Is that Malden?
Yes, Bill Maudlin, Maudlin, drew this cartoon, who himself became very famous. And in fact, Bill Maudlin was the man who taught me. I was a high school newspaper editor, I guess, and the gentleman who taught me years before, many years before, he was a senior citizen by the time he taught me in high school journalism, had taught Bill Maudlin and stayed in touch with him, said he was a hell of a guy. He also taught Steve Allen, by the way, the first host of the Tonight Show. And that's your trivia. And then I also wanted to quickly show you David Dushman, who passed away last month at the age of 98. He's the gentleman I talked about who had been in the Soviet Red Army on January 27, 45. His tank crashed through the gates and they liberated Auschwitz. And to his great credit, he spent the rest of his life up until 3-4 years ago speaking to groups of various sizes and various locations and standing witness to what he had seen. When he passed away last month, he was the last human being on earth who was there and saw Auschwitz on the day it was finally liberated. So I wanted to pay, as you see, what he looked like too, since we talked about him at the end of the last class. Now, and by the way, of course, that is children of Auschwitz on the day of the liberation. Today, we're going to go back in time a little bit. We were in early 1945, really class before last, and we're just beginning to talk about Okinawa, the last stop before the invasion or the conclusion of the Pacific War in Japan, the last of the islands in the island hopping campaign. But I want to go back. I want to go back to actually 1942 and talk about the Philippines. We've referenced the Philippines several times. We really haven't talked about it in any detail. And I wanted to take you through today 1941 really, December 8th, to 1945, and the Philippines campaign. And we're going to do it a little differently. And for that, Judy and Charles get all the credit. Because can I share this, Judy? She sent me an email, and she made a very wonderful point. She was very complimentary and nice in her email, as she always is. But she said, you know, I'd like to know more about the women who served in the Second World War. For that matter, women in history generally. And it is true that when you're talking about the Second World War, for example, the generals, the admirals, most of the famous officers like Patton and Montgomery, they all happen to be men. That's the way the world worked in those days, and unfortunately, and as a result, it is true. You don't see too many women highlighted in the Second World War. They were there, they were all over the world, and they were here at home, in war factories, but again, they don't get the attention that they certainly deserve. So, with a little gentle prodding, I scrapped the lecture I had planned for today and wrote a new one, much to my wife's distress. And what I had written we'll get back to in the future. And for the most part, we all know about the Philippines campaign. We all know about MacArthur. We all know about I Shall Return, all of that. But I'm going to try to look at it today primarily through the eyes of 77 women who also served in the Philippines, who were officers of the Army and Navy, U.S. Army and Navy, and they were nurses. And their story is remarkable. Quick orientation. How many people have been to the Philippines? I thought so. How many people lived in the Philippines? I thought so. Well, you can correct me when I mispronounce things, and if my geography gets screwed up. You'll notice, of course, this is a modern map, but just to give you kind of a location. The island of Luzon in the Philippines is where we are focusing. You can see that Bataan, where it's located to the south, leading into Manila Bay. Corregidor, this tiny little island fortress right off of Bataan. Manila, the capital, and we'll talk about Manila, is right across the bay. And another location that you'll be hearing today is Santo Tomas. And Santo Tomas.
Your pointer works.
Oh, my pointer works. I didn't think it did. It does, huh? It does, huh?
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, you
Never
can
mind.
see Santo Tomas. And then this is a reminder from my wife. She actually wrote this, and somehow it appeared in a slide. Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors, or your ancestors were. Written in a letter by one of Pat's favorites, Abigail Adams, to her husband John in 1776. So remember the ladies is one of the mottos for today's lecture. If you can't hear me, let me know.
Move it a little closer.
Now,
A
what?
little bit closer to you. There you go.
A little bit closer. Is this better? I don't walk around as much if I have a stationary mic. Again, we know how the campaign, the war in the Philippines began. The Day of Infamy, Pearl Harbor, December the 7th. In most accounts, they list the attack on the Philippines by the Japanese. The initial air raid is December the 8th, 1941. It was an invasion in northern Luzon. I guess I could go back to the map. It was in fact, let me go forward. There it is. This, by the way, is a Signal Corps map. December 41, January of 42, gives you, again, a little feel. You can see those red arrow dots. That's where the Japanese aircraft and then later troops were invading the Philippine Islands. And again, December the 8th is really about the initial air raid from the Japanese on Clark Field in the Philippines was about 10 hours after the attack at Pearl Harbor. In command, of course, shy retiring fellow on stage right, Douglas MacArthur. He was commander of what was called U.S. Far East Forces, and he is seen here in a photograph about a month before the war in the Philippines began. The man standing next to him with the World War I style hat on is Jonathan Wainwright. His friends called him Skinny Wainwright, not his subordinates, but his friends called him Skinny Wainwright, who was a lieutenant general and was number 2. He was second in command to MacArthur in the Philippines. MacArthur, of course, at this time was already or about to be a 4-star general. Caught in the December 8th attacks and all that followed, the Japanese bombing, the murderous invasion, were 99 Army and Navy nurses. And it's worth remembering, by the way, that when we discuss what they went through, none of them had any formal combat training. That wasn't done in those days. They hadn't been trained in how to use a weapon of any kind. And yet they would be in the most dangerous, they'd be in a combat zone for much of the war. In fact, these 99 Army and Navy nurses would become the first group of American women to see combat in the Second World War. They definitely would be right in the middle of a combat zone. And unfortunately, later, they would become the first group of American women to be captured by the enemy, in this case the Japanese, and imprisoned. Remember, by the way, that these women were also officers. This is unlike the First World War. There was from the very beginning in any theater, European, Pacific, African, North African theater, there was always a tremendous shortage of doctors and an even more severe shortage of nurses. So they were granted upon completing their training and inducted into the armed forces. The military nurses at World War II were officers, mostly lieutenants, and it's also sad but true that while they had the rank or the privilege of being an officer, they did not make the same pay did not get the same pay as their male counterparts. What a shock, I know. At the end of the first week after the Japanese attack, or around December the 14th, 1942, the American naval base at, is it Keowee? Those who've been to the Philippines?
Say what?
Canacao.
The only thing I say, if you go to the Philippines, they don't call it baton, they call it bataan.
Okay,
Bataan.
say that again.
Well, nobody else does, but I mean,
Okay.
that's the way it's pronounced.
Okay, say it again, please.
Bataan.
Bataan.
You
Okay.
break the word apart at two A's.
Well, today we're going to call it baton. But it's good to know how it's really pronounced in the Philippines. I guess this is the Americanized version. Fort, again, end of the first week at Conakao, Fort Stoughtonburg, Clarkfield, Fort McKinley, they all laid in ruins. The American Filipino Air Force had been destroyed on December the 8th. So within a week, the major airfields were gone, and MacArthur had no air power. This is the Sternberg Hospital in the Philippines. This picture is from 1940. You can see it's enormous. In fact, the Sternberg Hospital was called the jewel of the Army's medical facilities in the entire Pacific Theater. It was well equipped with medical supplies. It was well staffed until war came. Many people found it, maybe if you're a nurse or a doctor, the most attractive place to be in the Pacific. Again, before the war came. For that reason, it could recruit some of the best and the brightest for assignment there. Of course, that all changed with the attack in December of 41. Before you knew it, within a week and less, there were military and civilian casualties stretched out everywhere. They were on the floors. Many severely in need of treatment. Windows in much of Sternberg had shattered, and one of the problems that the nurses and doctors early encountered was shortage of glass. There was a lot of glass in a lot of windows in Sternberg Hospital, and they were constantly being blown out by the bombing and lacerating patients and staff alike. I mentioned that there were a shortage of nurses, and one of the things that was occurring was a heavy recruitment effort, which would only become larger as the war went along, to recruit nurses into the military, the Army and the Navy. And in the beginning, look at the poster. In the beginning, if you're a nurse, obviously you're going to be gorgeous. The country needs you. You're going to have a nice white and blue uniform. You'll probably get invited by male officers to a lot of cocktail parties, and it'll be a good life. That's how the early propaganda to recruit nurses portrayed things. Then as the war progressed, this is the Army Nursing Corps, they began to make the posters a little less demeaning, if you will, a little bit more respectful. And now women in the nursing corps look like they could be serious. They could be an officer. If you are a registered nurse, not yet 40 years of age, apply to the Surgeon General, the United States Army, Washington, D.C. Again, you see the evolution. And then as the war progressed, this is by the Navy, and again, the Navy now is also getting with, well, women, yeah, they're all dressed in white, but they actually look like they could be an officer. And in fact, now they're saying be a commissioned officer in the Navy, become a Navy nurse. Again, further evolution. There's always more Army than Navy nurses at this point, but they were catching up. And then finally, one of the later recruitment posters, later in the war, okay, let's get real. We really do need more nurses, and okay, they kind of look more like this. And the work, maybe it's not so glamorous. Maybe they're actually wearing Army fatigues or dungarees or something of the sort, not nice, crisp uniforms. And it's hard work. But again, if you want to make a real contribution to the war effort, become a nurse. I think that's to me, that's very interesting to see the evolution of how recruitment of women into the nursing corps was being sold, if you will, to the American public. On December 23rd, again, we're still in 1941, FDR, President Roosevelt, announced alongside with him was Winston Churchill. They were at the White House. They announced that while the attack had been on Pearl Harbor, as we know, within a couple days, Hitler had declared war on the United States. And the President and the Prime Minister announced that the primary theater of war would be the European theater. We had a two-front war. We were stretched very thin. We were woefully unprepared for the war. And so it was made clear that, yes, we will avenge Pearl Harbor. Yes, Japan is also at war with the United States. But most of the supplies, most of the men and women, most of the aircraft, ammunition and so forth will be going to the European theater. Once there was victory in Europe, we would, not sequentially, but it would overlap, but first victory in Europe and then victory over Japan in the Pacific. And MacArthur was told that do with what you can, do with what you have, the forces you already have for now, and help will be coming later. Which led to this cartoon. Anything coming from the outside world, says MacArthur. Nothing but praise, sir. Meaning no guns, no supplies, no aircraft, but do a good job. And again, very much cartoon, very symbolic of the times. Douglas MacArthur and his commanders decided to implement what was known as War Plan Orange 3. War Plan Orange 3, which had been on the shelves actually as a war plan, a possible option for decades. Now was dusted off. And at the heart of War Plan Orange 3 was that to avoid if American forces and Filipino forces are attacked by Japan, to avoid massive early casualties and massive destruction of property, Manila, the capital, will be declared an open city. Why, by the way, why would you declare Manila an open city? Sweden. You know, it's Sweden. It's like a neutral city. We'll declare Manila an open city, neutral city, and therefore the hope was that the enemy, would respect the neutrality of Manila and would not raise it to the ground. That, of course, didn't turn out so well. All military, part of the plan was also that all military personnel, their equipment, would retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. So again, remember the map. They would retreat down southern part of Luzon to the Bataan Peninsula in this area, and they would fight, and they would also retreat to Corregidor, the fortress island, and they from there they would command American and Filipino forces on Bataan, on Corregidor, and if anything, maybe create a holding action until eventually Washington could send help. As the laughter noted from Bill, the only problem with that plan was that it had no chance of succeeding, and in fact, everyone pretty much knew it.
What's the scale of miles there? Just give me a little concept of how large that is. What's the scale of miles?
The scale of miles.
Top right, it's 50.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
You might
just,
see it better on the other one, but
0 to 50.
that's 50, right? So it's about, all right. So
Is
we're
that
probably
helpful?
talking about maybe 600 miles from one end of the island to another.
Probably.
Okay.
Something of that order.
All right.
And I'm just guessing by looking at it with you. I don't know. I have never been to the Philippines, so I don't know exactly. But yeah, that's probably about right. And of course, Corregidor, which is an island, is very close to the Bataan area. Bataan is really a peninsula on Luzon, and you could get from Bataan to Corregidor. It was like 2 miles away, something like that. If that's helpful. The main invasion assault was underway, again, December 22nd, 1942. General Masahiro Homma, Homma, the Japanese commander, head of the 14th Japanese Army, led 43,000 Japanese troops in landing in northern Luzon. I did make a note. When they landed in northern Luzon, they were 125 miles from Manila. So that gives you some sense of the perspective. On December 23rd, 41, MacArthur ordered General Wainwright to withdraw his troops to the Bataan Peninsula on the west coast of Luzon. And again, Bataan. It was an area of densely wooded ravines, swamps, heavily vegetated. It was a jungle, actually. And here, Americans, along with their Filipino allies, would fight what is actually the first major land battle of the Second World War. There was a further complication. You notice I always point here when I should point here. Oh, there is a better map for you. And again, you can see across Manila, that is Manila. There was a further complication. Here's a Life magazine, December the 8th, 41. Commander of the Far East. MacArthur, as he liked to do, looking heroically off into the distance for the Life magazine cover. MacArthur had made a mistake. Wouldn't be his first, wouldn't be his last. But throughout 41, the U.S. command had established supply depots and dumps on Bataan. But in the event of eventual attack by the enemy, but they had not stocked them to full capacity. And then MacArthur, this is earlier in 41, had decided that actually he wanted to fight further upland from the Bataan Peninsula on Luzon. So he had the supply depots and dumps that existed moved, moving much of their reserve of food, ammunition, spare parts, and equipment off of the Bataan Peninsula. Now comes the attack on December 8th, comes the land invasion. By December 22nd, American Filipino forces are fighting in retreat. They're retreating as they're fighting the enemy, and they were forced to leave behind above the Bataan Peninsula in Luzon most of the supplies and the supply depots and dumps that they had been erecting throughout the year. Again, MacArthur made a mistake, and most of what they had in reserve would fall into the hands of the Japanese. Also, we had thousands. By the way, I mentioned the open city of Manila. This is taken shortly after MacArthur declares Manila an open city and hopefully a neutral city. And you have the last stand on Luzon. And again, you can see where American troops make their final stand before they move down to the peninsula. This is the peninsula, this kind of this thumb-looking part of Luzon. Corregidor was also used. It was heavily armed. It was used as an area to block the entrance, hopefully, of enemy shipping. And on December 23rd, MacArthur, and this is part of the original plan, left Manila and joined Filipino-American forces in the underground fortress of Malinta. It's called the Malinta Tunnel. Malinta Tunnel, I'll show you a picture, is on Corregidor. And the Malinta Tunnel, it's M-A-L-I-N-T-A, will play a very important role, as we'll talk about in a moment, in the story of the women of Bataan and Corregidor. Again, MacArthur moves there on December 23rd. He takes with him the president of the Philippines, some other political and military personnel, leaves Wainwright in command of the forces on the Bataan Peninsula. And by the way, one of the controversies is MacArthur took with him his wife and his young son. Unusual, but he'd been in the Philippines, as you know, for some time and for years, and so he had his wife and his young son, Arthur MacArthur, with him, and so he took them with him when they moved to Corregidor. By the way, those who've been there, Corregidor is known as, its nickname is the Rock. You'll see many references to the Rock, and it had been called that for a long time. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, an additional 7,000 Japanese soldiers landed 60 miles southeast of Manila. In effect, you now had Manila, the open city, in the jaws of a great pincer movement. The best that American and Filipino forces could hope for now was to exact as heavy a toll from the invaders as possible and to buy time. Needless to say, the open city neutrality concept did not work. I don't think MacArthur ever thought it really would, but they made the effort. and over Christmas from December 24th to December 26th. I'll come back to that. You see the Japanese ferociously bombing Manila. Their goal was utter destruction of the capital city. And again, to get a picture of the situation years in, this chart I think does a good job. Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, Malaya, Thailand, Shanghai, and Midway, December 7th and 8th. We declare war, United States and Britain on the 8th. Japan invades the Philippines and takes Guam on the 10th. The Japanese invade Burma on the 11th. They invade Borneo on the 16th. They invade Hong Kong on the 18th. Japan invades Luzon in the Philippines. On the 22nd, they take Wake Island on the 25th. Hong Kong surrenders on the 25th. And Manila is declared an open city on the 26th. Not a good month for America and its allies. And I think this chart, by the way, gives you a good feel how it's just one thing after another, not just in the Philippines, but elsewhere, all in favor of the Japanese forces. Now, the nurses. There's two people, by the way, that I'll mention many times. Can't really see over here. I should not ignore this side. The woman on stage left is Josie Nesbitt. Josie Nesbitt, Nesbit. She is one of the most what?
Microphone.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
You can take handed.
Josie Nesbitt on the left, our left, stage left, will be one of the two most important nurses in the Philippines, on Bataan, well, in Manila, Bataan, Corregidor, and then during their internment. She will be there for all of it. Next to her is her superior officer, who is the other name you should know, who is it is Matheson. Let me make sure I have the spelling right. Yeah, Davison. I knew that wasn't right. It's Maud Davison, Davison, who's a woman in the middle, and who will be an overall command of Army nurses, and really, in effect, Army and Navy nurses throughout these years in the Philippines. Two very important women. This, by the way, this is taken on Bataan. This photograph in early 1942. Joni Nesbitt was the one who was picked by Maud Davison to move their staff. Their staff now is a staff of 87 nurses from Manila to Bataan. So they left that large hospital that I showed you early and go to Bataan. And some of them also go, some of them stay there, some go on down to Corregidor as well, and to the Balenta Tunnel. Unlike what they had seen pre-war at the Manila hospital, the nurses now are not being sent to hospitals with red tile roofs and whitewashed walls. Quite the contrary. This is going to be jungle hospital situation, and it's going to be something that is extremely challenging and dangerous for all concerned. In effect, when they are sent to Bataan, or when they're sent to Bataan and when they're sent to Corregidor, they are going into a combat zone. Therefore they become again the first group of American women sent to duty on a battlefield. The Japanese storm Manila, by the way, on January the 2nd, short time after the evacuation, again, the people in Manila are treated savagely by their Japanese invaders. When Josie Nesbitt, the woman on the left, and her, in this case, her 50 nurses, arrived in Bataan, they established what's called Hospital Number 1. Now, Hospital Number 1 is 29 rough-hewn buildings. They're really sheds with walls of woven bamboo and roofs of thatched grass. They were constructing them on the fly with the help of some civilians and some other military personnel, but very primitive. And again, unlike when they've been on Manila originally, now you're scrambling for medical supplies. Now you're scrambling for anything you can think of to treat wounded soldiers and civilians who would come into the hospital. And again, you're talking about women with no formal military training in weapons. In fact, they really hadn't been trained in battlefield medicine. They would learn on the fly. And in the first days of Japan, they spent a great deal of time not only helping with the construction and setting up of the hospital and associated clinics, but also they became amazingly creative at coming up with substitutes for bandages, for medicine, a lot of homemade medicine, things they could conjure up. To give you an example of how primitive, by the way, the medicine was, after all this is over, after the nurses leave the Philippines for the last time in 1945, one of them goes on assignment in the United States, and actually they're in Hawaii at the time, and a doctor asks her to get him some penicillin. And she says, "What is that?" You know, they didn't have penicillin, didn't even know that it existed during the Philippines. On New Year's Day in 1942, the Japanese came within, dive bombers came within 100 yards of hitting Hospital 1. It was quickly clear that they were going to need another hospital a little further into the jungle, providing a little bit more cover. They are performing, think of this, they're performing surgery at Hospital 1 and later Hospital 2, while around them bombing is going on, hand-to-hand combat is occurring, and casualties, military and some civilian, are pouring into Hospital 1, later Hospital 2, in trucks, buses, by mule, horse carts, and on foot. How intense did things become? On January 16th, 1942, at Hospital 1, their makeshift operating room performed 187 major surgical procedures in one 24-hour period. Think of that, 187 major medical procedures in one 24-hour period. This is, at the time, 4 or 5 times the average number of cases if they were at a stateside hospital.
Jim,
Yes.
just look at time. Just watching for your break.
Oh, for the break? Okay, we'll break here in just a couple minutes. I promise I'll give you a break, but let me go to a part where we can easily stop. January 15th of 42, General MacArthur sends a message to his forces on Bataan. And again, he's at the headquarters now, the Melinta Tunnel on Corregidor. And yes, it was 2 miles. Corregidor is 2 miles from Bataan. His message to everyone, American and Filipino forces, says, help is on the way from the United States. Thousands of troops and hundreds of planes are being dispatched. The exact time of arrival of reinforcement is unknown. It is imperative our troops hold until these reinforcements arrive, and no further retreat is possible. So there's a sense of relief among the soldiers, the doctors, the nurses. Their commander has just told them that relief will come. Relief is on the way. In fact, troops, doctors and nurses, when they're off duty, which is almost never, begin lining up on the beach and scanning the horizon, looking for the relief convoys that they were promised were coming. Again, MacArthur says this to them. People want to believe it, so they do believe it among his troops and doctors and nurses. In reality, I think you would have to say that it was more of a morale boost, or maybe a hope that even MacArthur must have realized wasn't going to be, probably wasn't going to be realized. 2 days after the message to everyone, help is on the way, MacArthur sends a radiogram. This is not given out to everybody. This is to the War Department in Washington. And here you get the real scoop. MacArthur tells General George C. Marshall and President Roosevelt, quote, the food situation here is becoming serious. For some time I have been on half rations, and the result will soon become evident in the exhausted condition of the men. It said men and women. I have asked for blockade running ships. No reply has been received. This seems incredible to me, continues MacArthur. I cannot overemphasize the psychological reaction that will take place here unless something tangible is done in this direction. I repeat that if something is not done to meet the general situation which is developing, the disastrous results will be monumental. Okay, let me stop there. That's a good place to stop. We're in extreme distress. And will relief be on the way?
10 minutes.
Let's take 10 minutes.